He was handed a fortune worth $2 billion in today's money, and he spent the next 50 years losing it, one check at a time. How does a man lose that much, with no thief and no crash to blame, no one but himself? His name was George Huntington Hartford II, heir to one branch of the A&P grocery fortune, the store that stood on almost every American main street for 100 years. He never had to earn a cent of it. Then, in 1992, that same heir walked into a federal courthouse in Manhattan and filed for bankruptcy. $2 billion gone. That bankruptcy is a matter of public record. The New York Times reported the filing, and years later ran the obituary that laid the whole account bare. An inheritance estimated at about $90 million and about $80 million of it lost. Those estimates do not all match to the dollar. $90 million is the figure both the New York Times and the Boston Globe carry, while one wire account at his death put the fortune closer to $100 million. We will hold to the 90, the number with the firmer paper trail behind it. Not stolen, not seized. Lost, over 50 years, by the man who owned it. There is even a full-length biography of his life, written by the journalist Lisa Gubernick, and its title gives away the whole ending before you open the cover. She called it Squandered Fortune. If you have never inherited a fortune, understand what you are looking at. This is the money you will never see, and the exact documented path by which one person can make that much of it disappear. This heir bought his own tropical island and gave it the name Paradise. He built a museum of white marble on Columbus Circle. Then came a magazine and a laboratory devoted to the study of handwriting. By the end, he had turned one of the largest inheritances in the country into a bankruptcy petition, a rented house, and a single trust fund he was never once permitted to touch. This is the story of how a man does that to himself, told the way the paper records tell it, with the dollar figures kept honest and the sources named out loud as we go. This story does not begin in that courthouse. It begins in 1859, in a single store in downtown Manhattan, and with the men who would build an empire the heir would never have to build himself. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company started as a modest shop that sold tea and coffee off the docks, and over the next 70 years it grew into the largest retailer on the planet. Consider the scale of that for a moment, because the scale is the whole point of what follows. By 1930, the company ran almost 16,000 stores. In 1929, it became the first store to sell $1 billion of goods in a single year. At a time when $1 billion was a figure the ordinary person could not hold in the mind. At its height, it was the largest grocery business in the world, and it did not feel like a company at all. It felt like part of the furniture of American life, as fixed and permanent as the change of the seasons. For the American over 60 watching this, that name is not a line in a history book. It is childhood. A&P was where your mother sent you for bread and coffee and a pound of butter. It was the red and gold sign on the corner in 10,000 towns, the store you walked into 1,000 times without ever once thinking about the family whose name hung above the door. The men who built that empire were George L. Hartford and John A. Hartford, two brothers the company knew as Mr. George and Mr. John. Their father, George Huntington Hartford, had helped found the company back in 1859, and it is his name, passed down through the family, that our heir would carry his whole life. The brothers ran the business with a caution that came close to obsession. They kept the company private and out of the reach of the stock market for as long as they could manage it. They put the profits back into the stores rather than into their own pockets. And when they did set their own fortunes aside, they did not leave the money loose and easy to spend. They locked it down into trusts and a foundation and structures built to outlast every last one of them. Remember the brothers, and remember how they chose to handle their money. It is the quiet difference this entire story turns on, and we will come back to it at the very end. The brothers had built the fortune up from nothing, dollar by dollar, and they knew in their bones how fast a fortune can walk back out the same door it came in. So they nailed it down. Their nephew never learned that lesson because he was never once made to build anything of his own. Our heir did not come down from either of those two brothers. He came from a third son. Edward Hartford, another of the founders' sons, took his share of the family money out of the grocery business early and went and made a second fortune of his own, this one in the automobile trade, with an invention for the shock absorber. When Edward died in 1922, he left his share of the A&P legacy to his two children. One was a daughter, Josephine. The other was a boy of 11, and his name was Huntington Hartford. That boy's cut of the family estate has been put, by a 1985 profile in Forbes magazine, at an estimated $90 million. On top of the $90 million came a living, an allowance of about $1.5 million a year, every year, for life. Let us do the one calculation that makes those numbers real, because a number you cannot feel is a number you cannot learn a thing from. $90 million in 1932, run through the Consumer Price Index at MeasuringWorth, comes to approximately $2.1 billion in today's money. $2 billion handed to a young man before he had done a single thing to earn it. And the allowance on top, that $1.5 million a year, would run to tens of millions of dollars a year in today's money, an income larger than the lifetime earnings of the families who shopped in his uncle's stores. Here's the distinction the record forces us to keep straight, and it matters more than any other line in this video. He did not inherit the company. He did not inherit the whole A&P fortune, and he did not inherit billions of dollars in a single lump. What came down to him was one branch's slice of a much larger family fortune. And the story of the rest of his life is the story of a man who could not hold on to even that slice. $90 million and 5 long decades to lose it in. The uncles had needed a lifetime of hard work to pile that money up. Their nephew was handed the top of the finished pile on the day he came of age, and asked to do one thing with it, which was not to lose it. It was the single task he could not perform. You may have felt a much smaller version of this feeling yourself. A windfall that should have lasted and did not. A tax refund, a bonus at work, a little inheritance from a relative who passed on, money that felt for a moment like a door swinging open, and then it was gone inside a month or two with nothing left to show for it. That sting is an ordinary human thing, and it does not care how many zeros sit on the check. Now take that feeling and stretch it out across $90 million and 50 long years, and you are standing inside the life of George Huntington Hartford. He had more of it than you, and more time than you, and so it took him half a century to arrive at the same empty place. And that is the quiet horror sitting underneath the spectacle. We tell this as a story about a private island and a marble museum, a life so far above our own that it plays like a fable. But the mistake at the dead center of it is the most ordinary one there is. He spent the principal as though it were the interest over and over until the principal was gone. It is the oldest way there is to lose money, and he found it even with $2 billion of today's dollars in his hands. The uncles did give the young man his one chance at the family business. He was put to work at the A&P headquarters in the Gray Bar building in Manhattan and set to the task of tracking the weekly sales of bread and pound cake across the stores. It did not take. In 1934, he took a day away from the office to go and watch the Harvard and Yale football game. Yale won that afternoon, 14-0. And that one day at the stadium, by the account in his New York Times obituary, was the end of his career in the family business. The heir to the biggest grocery empire on earth could not be trusted to sit at a desk and count the loaves. You could call it a small thing, a young man skipping a day of work to see a football game. But it was the man entire in a single gesture, and the people around him saw it. The architect Frank Lloyd Wright was said to have taken Hartford's measure in one cutting remark. Hartford, Wright said, was the sort of fellow who would come up with an idea, pinch it in the fanny, and run. That was the pattern of his entire life. An idea, a burst of money, a great deal of noise, and then the running off toward the next idea before the last one ever had a chance to work. Over the coming decades, he would have a great many ideas, and behind each one of them, he would pour a piece of that $90 million until there was almost none of it left to pour. You can see the whole rest of the story from right here. A young man who could not be bothered to count loaves for one summer was now loose in the world with $2 billion of today's dollars and a head crowded with dreams. And there was no longer anybody above him with the standing to tell him no. Now, a cautious heir could have stopped right there. He could have taken the $90 million, banked it, lived a long and quiet and comfortable life, and left the whole of it to his own children and grandchildren. Hartford did the exact opposite. To raise the cash for the ventures already forming in his head, he did something that still stops you cold when you read it. He sold $40 million of his A&P shares. Consider what that meant. He was cashing himself out of the very empire that had made him, selling off his own piece of the family business, and he was doing it to chase a dream that lay 1,000 miles to the south, out in the warm water off the Bahamas. It was a decision he would have every reason to regret for the rest of his long life. In 1959, he found the dream. Off the coast of Nassau, there sat a stretch of land then known as Hog Island, and Hartford bought 4/5 of it from a financier named Wenner Gren. He poured a fortune into the place, into docks and gardens and a grand resort hotel, and he gave the island a brand new name, a name that told you everything about the man who now owned it. Paradise Island. For a few short years, he had the very paradise he had paid for. Then it came apart, the way everything he touched came apart. By the account in his obituary, Hartford lost an estimated $25 to $30 million on that island. In 1966, he sold out his interest and let the place go. And here's the bitter part of it. The land he had renamed Paradise passed into other hands and became the seat of a booming casino empire, Resorts International, a fortune that rose up out of that same sand without him, and without a single dime of it going back into his pocket. He had bought himself an island, named it for heaven, and then handed it over to the people who would make the real money on it. That was one island, one venture. And in the years all around it, the same thing kept happening again, in one new and expensive form after another. This is the thing to understand about the way he lost it. He was not swindled out of Paradise Island. There was no cunning outsider who slipped it away from him in the night. He bought high, he ran the place into the ground, and he sold low, and he did all of it to himself, with his own name on every last contract. Back in Manhattan, in 1964, Hartford opened a museum of his very own at 2 Columbus Circle, in a strange and striking building of white marble that he raised up to hold the kind of art he believed in and no other. He called it the Gallery of Modern Art. The building alone cost him $7.4 million. Run that figure through the same consumer price index at MeasuringWorth, and $7.4 million in 1964 comes to close to $77 million in today's money. $77 million for a museum. And the museum did not last. It stayed open for 5 years. By 1969, the doors were shut, and Hartford had walked away from the marble building he had paid such a fortune to raise. It was the whole pattern once more. The grand idea, the enormous check, and then the walking away. Another piece of the 90 million gone into the ground. And notice the shape of it, because it is the same shape every single time. Hartford never lacked for taste, or for vision, or for the nerve to write an enormous check. What he lacked was the patience to sit through the long, dull middle years, the part where the real work of keeping a fortune gets done. He was a man built for opening nights. The slow tending that turns a grand project into a lasting fortune was work he never learned to do. He was not done, not by a long way. He started a magazine of the arts and entertainment and gave it the name Show. It went through at least 3 separate versions over the years and swallowed, by the estimate in the Times, perhaps $8 million before it ceased publication in 1973. And then there is the venture that tells you more about Huntington Hartford than any of the others. What comes next is the part that still does not quite make sense. Hartford took real money, serious money, and put it into a laboratory that he called the Handwriting Institute. He held a genuine, lifelong belief that a person's penmanship was a key to their aptitude and their character, that the loops and the slants and the pressure of your handwriting gave away who you were underneath. Put it in plain words. Here was a grocery heir, a man of enormous inherited wealth who could have done anything at all with it, funding, in all seriousness, the study of handwriting, the field they call graphology. This is the one that even the people who were fond of him could not quite bring themselves to defend, which, looking back on it, was either the mark of a true original or the mark of a man with far more money than judgment. The weight of the record falls hard on the second, and yet there is something almost touching in it. A man who had been handed everything, sitting in a laboratory, trying to prove that the secret of a person's worth was hidden in the curl of their letters. He was looking for the one thing all that money had never explained to him, which was how to tell a good bet from a bad one. There was Speed Park, too, an automated parking garage in the middle of Manhattan, meant to stack the city's cars by machine. It lost $1.8 million. And now the careful part, the guard the record demands that we put up before we go on. Each of these losses was a piece of that same $80 million going down. Not one of them was a separate sum stacked on top of it. The island, the museum, the magazine, the garage, the handwriting laboratory, all of it. The New York Times obituary and the Boston Globe both walk the very same ground. A fortune this size does not go all at once. It drains away in installments, quarter by quarter and year by year, and Hartford paid down every last one of them himself. And notice who did the paying. It was not a market collapse, and it was not a crooked partner, and it was not a run of bad luck. It was him. Every check that drained that fortune was one he signed with a steady hand and a clear head, in pursuit of something he wanted at that moment. Nobody did it to him. He did it, one patient decision at a time, to himself. If he had stopped after the island, or after the Marble Museum, or after the magazine, he would still have died a rich old man. He did not stop. By the start of the 1990s, the clock had almost run all the way out, and the $90 million was almost gone. So in 1992, in the United States District Court in Manhattan, George Huntington Hartford II filed for bankruptcy. He lost the townhouse he had owned on East 30th Street. Later accounts put the filing's debts up toward $10 million against assets of well under $1 million, though those figures were never settled down to a single agreed number in the record, the heir to the A&P fortune, standing there as a bankrupt in a federal court. That is the exact moment the thumbnail on this video points to, and that moment is real. But here's the detail that changes how you should see every part of what came before it. Even in bankruptcy, Huntington Hartford was not left with nothing at all. By his own New York Times obituary, at the very time of that filing, he was still the beneficiary of a trust fund that paid him more than $500,000 a year. Set that against the bankruptcy, and it does not seem possible. A bankrupt man, and $500,000 a year still flowing into him. The old caution of the uncles, the men who plowed their money into locked trusts 60 years before he ever reached that courtroom, reached all the way across those 6 decades and caught their nephew before he could hit the ground. There was money the family had tied up in a shape that Huntington could not spend down to nothing, no matter how hard he tried. And it was the one thing standing between him and the street. Remember the brothers and their locked trusts? This is the moment they come back into the story. There is a strange kind of justice in it. The same men who could not trust their nephew with the family business could not, in the end, quite bear to let him fall the whole way either. The lock they had put on that money was never meant as a punishment. It was there to save him from himself. And across 60 long years, that is what it did. Huntington Hartford lived another 16 years after that bankruptcy filing. He spent that final stretch of his life far away from New York, down in the Bahamas, in a place called Lyford Cay, a private gated community out on the western end of the island of New Providence. He moved there in 2004, and on the 19th of May, 2008, he died there in his own bed. He was 97 years old. His death was announced to the world by his daughter, Juliet Hartford. And here the title of this very video earns its one careful correction, because the real story is stranger and sadder than the easy version of it. He died on a Bahamian island. Yes, that part is true. But he did not die on his island. Paradise Island, the one island he had once owned outright, had been gone from his hands for 42 years by the time he died, sold off back in 1966. Lyford Cay was a gated neighborhood that he rented into at the very end of his life, land he did not own a single foot of, taken the shape of that. The man who once bought an entire tropical island and named it Paradise died a tenant at the end on ground that belonged to somebody else. Nor did he die penniless And plain honesty demands that we say so out loud, because the easy version gets this part wrong too. His daughter Juliet told the magazine Vanity Fair that at the very end, her father still had about $11 million to his name, held in a trust fund that he had never once touched in his whole life. He lived out his final years in real comfort, in a seaside villa worth something like $6 million, kept there, at the last, by the one piece of the fortune that he had never been able to get his hands around and burn. He had written his own verdict on all of it decades before, in an essay for Esquire magazine in 1968. In that one respect, he wrote, he had been Horatio Alger in reverse. The great American rags to riches story run backward. A man who started his life with everything and worked his way down year by year to almost nothing at all. He had said it about himself, and he was right to. Horatio Alger wrote his stories about poor boys who climbed to the top on pluck and hard work. Hartford began at the very top and climbed down, hand over hand, for half a century, with enough money and enough leisure to make the long descent slow and comfortable the whole way. So where did the money go, the money that did not vanish into islands and museums and handwriting? It was not Huntington's slice. His slice drained down towards zero across his lifetime, and the little that survived of it he was never once allowed to touch. The money that lasted, the money that is still doing something in the world today, was the UNCLES's money. And it lasted for one reason above all others, because of the way the two brothers chose to build it in the first place. In 1929, the very same year that A&P became the first store to sell $1 billion of goods, the two brothers, John A. Hartford and George L. Hartford, set up a foundation and put John's name on the front of it. The John A. Hartford Foundation still exists today, right now, as you watch this. It gave up its ownership stake in the grocery chain a long time ago, and it turned the whole of its work toward a single cause: the health and the care of older Americans. It has given away hundreds of millions of dollars in grants across the decades since, and it funds the training of the doctors and the nurses who care for the aging in this country at this very moment. The uncles have been gone for more than half a century, and their money is still, today, looking after the old. There is one last turn in all of this, and it is the hardest turn of them all. Nor did the store itself survive. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, the chain that built the entire fortune, a giant with almost 16,000 stores that was once the biggest retailer anywhere on earth, filed for bankruptcy protection in 2015, and, by the end of that same year, ceased to exist. The A&P sign on your mother's old corner is gone now too, taken down for the last time. Think about how complete that erasure is. The fortune, scattered to the wind. The heir, bankrupt and long buried. And now the empire itself. The 16,000 stores, the $1 billion year, the red and gold sign a whole country grew up under, wound down, and switched off for good. Time came for all of it, the way time comes in the end for everything built by human hands. So look at what came out of that one grocery empire and hold the two things side by side. Two separate pools of money, born from the very same source. One pool was left loose, in the open hands of an heir who chased tropical islands and marble museums and the secret meaning of handwriting, and it drained away to almost nothing inside a single lifetime. The other pool was tied down into a structure that was built, on purpose, to outlive the very men who made it, and that one is still writing checks for the care of the old this year. What protected the uncle's money was never the size of it. It was the shape they had the foresight to keep it in, a foundation and a set of locked trusts that no single heir, however determined and however inventive, could ever manage to spend all the way down to the floor. That is the lesson worth carrying home from a story this size. The surviving fortune survived because of the structure built around it, the lock and the trust and the foundation with a purpose written into its charter, the kind of thing that no single reckless owner is able to pull apart on a whim. The uncles built that structure on purpose because they had watched money come and go and knew what it took to hold on to it. Their nephew was handed a fortune with no such structure on it at all, and he spent the next 50 years proving, dollar by dollar, why the structure was the thing that mattered. George Huntington Hartford II was handed one of the great American fortunes and spent half a century getting rid of it piece by piece, with both hands. The men who made that fortune in the first place had the wisdom to make certain that the part of it that mattered to them could never be spent at all. Today, in an office that still carries one of their names, that money is at work, doing the thing the heirs 90 million never did. It is looking after somebody,